The wolves came down the ridge just after the first frost, same as they always did, but this year something was different. They didn't circle the homestead. They didn't linger by the fence. They didn't test the smokehouse door or dig at the chicken run. Instead, they stopped 100 yards out, close enough to smell, but never closer. They sat in the snow, 7 of them, with their yellow eyes fixed on the cabin, not moving, not snarling, just watching. And then, one by one, they turned back into the trees, leaving not even a paw print in the hard crust of snow beneath the pines. Inside that cabin, a boy named Thomas Blake watched them disappear through the slats in the window shutter. His hands trembled, though not from cold, and he dared not speak for fear of disturbing whatever spell had just saved him and his mother. That moment marked the first peaceful winter night they'd known in 3 years, and the beginning of a legend that would spread through valleys and settlements, across fur posts and camps, through quiet talk at night when the howls carried too close. How did he do it? That question would echo for years, but the answer begins long before the wolves stopped coming. It begins with hunger, with grief, and with the night Thomas buried his father in a shallow grave beneath a dying tree. The year was 1839. The Blake family had settled on the southern edge of the Bridger-Teton wilderness 2 seasons earlier, drawn by promises of rich soil and open game. Elijah Blake, Thomas's father, was a man of iron spine and deep silence. He didn't trust towns, didn't trust lawmen, didn't trust much outside his own labor, and the rifles he kept oiled above the hearth. He built their cabin by hand, felled the trees himself, split every board, shingled the roof with birch from the creek line. He dug the well before the cabin even had a door. In those first months, the land seemed to reward him. The crops took, the game came easy, the cow gave milk like clockwork. But the wolves came too. At first they were shadows at the edge of torchlight, 1 or 2, curious, watchful. Then came the growls at midnight, the missing chickens, the claw marks on the barn. Elijah fought back the way most men did. Traps, poison, bullets, but it never seemed to end. The more wolves he killed, the more came. It was as if blood only summoned them. One night he shot 3 in the orchard, left their carcasses strung along the fence as warning. The next morning, they were gone, dragged into the woods. No blood trail, no footprints, just the sound of howling from the hills that didn't stop until dawn. That winter nearly broke them. The wolves circled nightly. The cow died in a snowdrift behind the barn, half-eaten by morning. The chickens froze to death when the coop was torn apart. Elijah's traps turned up twisted and empty. The wolves learned, adapted, and then, in late February, Elijah Blake went out with his rifle and never came back. Thomas was 12. He found his father 3 days later, 20 yards from a failed trapline. The body was mostly untouched, no blood, no torn flesh, but the snow was trampled flat in a wide circle around him, and the rifle had been snapped clean in half, not by claws, but by force. There was no mistaking what had happened. The wolves hadn't killed Elijah for food. They'd come for something else. Territory, dominance, revenge. Thomas buried his father in frozen ground, wrapped in a tarp, under the leaning ash tree behind the cabin. His mother, Margaret, didn't speak for days. When she finally did, she told Thomas that they'd be leaving come spring. But spring came late, and food came slower, and by the time the thaw reached their door, Margaret had changed. She didn't believe in fleeing anymore. "This land killed him," she told Thomas once, her voice hollow. "But I'll be damned if I let it kill us too." They stayed. What followed was a slow unraveling of everything Thomas had been raised to believe. The rules Elijah taught him: never show fear, never fire unless you're sure, always trap along the same trail. Those rules got them nowhere. Wolves tore through the fence again in June. They howled all summer. They left bones at the edge of the field. Margaret's hands bled from hoeing the garden because the plow mule refused to go near the tree line anymore. By the end of the second year, they had nothing left to lose. That's when Thomas began to change. He was 15 by then, thin as a whip, wiry, always watching. He'd stopped asking why, started asking how. Not how to kill wolves, how to keep them away. He watched the trees, he watched the wind. He listened to birds go silent and knew when the wolves were close before they showed themselves. And he noticed things, small things, that others would have missed. The way certain smells seemed to disturb the wolves, how they avoided particular sections of rock or old stumps. The time a trader left a satchel of salt pork near the fence, and no wolves came for 3 nights afterward. The way his mother's soap, made from lye and pine resin, seemed to linger in the air like fire smoke, and the wolves would wait longer to approach on days she boiled her batches. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start a theory. That fall, Thomas began experimenting, not with traps, but with barriers. He hung strips of fabric soaked in lye and ash around the property. He smeared animal fat mixed with bitter herbs along fence posts. He burned pine pitch in shallow clay bowls just before dusk, letting the thick smoke crawl low across the field like fog. And always, he watched, marked where the wolves crossed and where they did not. The results were inconsistent. Some nights they came anyway. Other nights they circled wide, howled once, and vanished. The trick, Thomas realized, wasn't just the repellent, it was the pattern. Wolves were smart, too smart for routine. If he did the same thing 2 nights in a row, they adapted. But if he rotated, shifted scents, changed placements, altered the smoke timing, they stayed cautious. That gave him an idea. What if he could make the entire homestead feel unnatural to them? He built what he called the circle. It was crude at first, 12 stakes, each with a different repellent, spread in an uneven perimeter around the cabin. One with vinegar-soaked rags, one with rendered bear grease and wild garlic, one with fish heads fermented in burlap, one with crushed pine needles, ash and old soap. The scents didn't need to be pleasant. They needed to be wrong, confusing, disorienting. Each night he shifted the contents. Each week he burned a different resin in the fire. He hung bones with feathers tied in twine so they clattered when wind came. Not loud, but enough to unsettle. It looked like madness. His mother said so more than once. But that winter, the wolves didn't come, not once. By spring, other settlers had started whispering. The Farleys had lost 2 goats. The Jamesons buried a son, mauled near the river bend. But the Blake place stayed untouched. Folks started asking questions. Margaret didn't answer, but Thomas did. Not with words, with results. He showed a trapper how to build a smoke bowl from river clay and pine pitch. He gave a woman a pouch of bitter herbs and told her where to hang it. He spoke little, but the instructions he gave worked. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. And every time someone came back saying the wolves still circled, still came near, still watched from the dark, Thomas would go silent, eyes narrowing, and he'd adjust the mixture, add a different scent, change the pattern. The key, he'd say eventually, wasn't in the ingredients. It was in the unpredictability. You have to make them doubt, he told his mother once, staring out the window at dusk. Make them wonder what's changed. Make them feel watched instead of watching. That's when they leave. But not everyone believed him, and not everyone wanted to follow the strange ways of a boy who talked about predator psychology like it was a science. One man in particular, Royce Weller, a former soldier turned rancher, decided to prove him wrong, and that decision would lead to the bloodiest night the valley had seen since the blizzards of '36. Royce Weller arrived in the valley with the kind of confidence that could only come from surviving one war and starting another. He was tall, broad, scarred across the temple from a musket ball he claimed never knocked him off his feet. By the time he rode into the Windmouth settlement, he had 2 oxen, a battered wagon, 3 rifles, a wife who spoke little English, and a low opinion of anyone not willing to fight nature head-on. He heard about Thomas Blake's wolf tricks within a week. By the end of the month, he was mocking them out loud in front of the trading post. Boys like that ought to be chasing squirrels, not giving advice on predators, he barked one afternoon, stomping snow from his boots. Wolves don't care about soap and chicken guts. They understand one thing, lead, he spat into the fire pit. You shoot enough of them, the rest learn. People didn't argue with Royce, not because they agreed, most didn't, but because Royce had a way of turning debates into fights. And fights, when Royce was involved, didn't end with bruises. They ended with someone needing stitching. Thomas never confronted him. He simply stopped visiting the post altogether. Margaret Blake went in his place, trading herbs and preserves, asking quietly if anyone else had seen wolves too close. She never mentioned her son's methods, but the silence in her eyes warned folks not to repeat Royce's words near the Blake homestead. Royce's ranch sat on higher ground, 3 miles west of the Blakes, with an open slope that gave good grazing but little cover. His wife, Annette, planted corn in the narrow field above the creek, and by early November their homestead looked prosperous. But prosperity meant little when winter dragged its teeth across the land. The first snow came late that year, December 9th, and with it came the wolves. It started the way it always did. Tracks near the shed, a chicken gone missing, then paw prints along the fence line, larger than any dog. Royce stayed up 3 nights straight, rifle in hand, waiting behind the porch rail. Saw nothing, heard howling, dismissed it. They're just testing us, he muttered to Annette. They'll move on once they see we ain't scared. But the wolves didn't move on. They came closer, left claw marks on the barn door. One morning, Royce found a paw print on the porch itself, wet with melted snow. Still steaming when he opened the door. He tried setting traps. They were triggered but never caught anything. He nailed a wolf pelt above the barn as warning. It was torn down by morning, shredded. That was when Annette went to the Blakes. She arrived alone, shawl clutched tight, boots muddy with melted frost. Thomas met her at the edge of the clearing. She didn't have to say a word. He could see it in her eyes. They were next, and the wolves were no longer testing. I need your help, she said simply. I brought what I could. She held out a small bag. Salt, herbs, lye soap, some strips of dried fat. Annette. It wasn't much. Thomas didn't even glance at it. "It's not about what you brought," he said, voice flat. "It's about what you're willing to change." Annette didn't hesitate. "Everything." That night, Thomas walked the 3 miles west in silence. He didn't carry a weapon, only a satchel of mixed elements, some of which no one but him understood. Margaret watched him go, lips pressed tight. She didn't stop him. She knew better. When Thomas arrived, Royce nearly slammed the door in his face. "You got some nerve showing up," the older man growled. "Think you're some kind of wizard now? Telling folks where wolves walk and don't walk?" Thomas didn't flinch. "They're already here," he said. "You just don't know how close." Royce bristled, but Annette's voice cut through from behind him. "Let him in." Reluctantly, Royce stepped aside. What happened next would be spoken of in every trading post and trapper's camp for years, not because of violence or miracle, but because of how fast things changed. Thomas didn't argue with Royce. He didn't explain his methods. He simply asked questions, direct, cold, deliberate. "Where do they circle? Which direction do they come from? What smells do you burn at night? Do you hang anything from your eaves? Where do you throw your waste?" Royce scoffed at each one. "They come from the woods, same as any other beast. Smells? I burn firewood, like a man, ain't no witch. Waste goes in the ditch, keeps the rats away." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's why they haven't left?" He spent the next 3 hours working. Royce didn't help. He stood at the window and watched, arms crossed, muttering curses. Thomas lit slow-burning bowls with pine pitch and sulfur bark, creating thick yellow smoke. He poured vinegar and ash in a wide circle around the livestock pen. He mixed crushed mint, garlic, and spoiled fat into sacks and hung them high from fence posts. He tied feathers to bits of twine that spun in the wind. He built a ring of scattered bone fragments, none from wolves, around the barn, symbols only he understood. And then, when the work was done, he left. "They'll test it tonight," he said as he passed Royce at the door. "If you change anything I did, they'll know. And they'll come closer." Royce said nothing. At dawn, Annette found the wolves in the field. Not close, never close, but gathered again in a crescent along the tree line, watching. They stayed until the sun rose high. Then, as before, they vanished. Not a footprint left behind. That silence lasted 3 nights. On the 4th night, Royce destroyed the circle. No one knew why. Maybe he felt mocked. Maybe the quiet unnerved him. Maybe he thought the wolves were gone for good and didn't want to owe a boy for his safety. He ripped down the pouches, kicked over the fire bowls, threw the bone fragments into the stream. He built a roaring bonfire in the front yard and shouted into the night, rifle in hand, daring them to come. They did. The attack began just after midnight. 7 wolves, at least, came in from 3 angles. One took down the goat pen door with a shoulder slam. 2 others tore through the coop. The rest circled the house. By the time Royce fired his first shot, they were already on the porch. Annette barricaded herself in the root cellar with nothing but a kitchen knife and a lantern. Royce fought alone. They found him in the morning, mauled near the barn, surrounded by 3 dead wolves and the burnt remnants of his bonfire. His rifle was shattered. His throat was torn out. The fence had been breached in 4 places. Blood streaked the snow all the way to the tree line. After that, no one mocked Thomas Blake again. He returned to the Weller place before noon that day. He didn't speak, didn't mourn. He rebuilt the circle, even stronger than before. This time, he added white clay marks on the barn door. He set stones in patterns beneath the windows. He told Annette to plant sage by the porch come spring and to burn the rest of her lye soap every Friday evening until the thaw. She obeyed without question. The wolves never came back. Word spread, slowly at first, then faster. By February, 3 more families had asked for his help. By March, 10. Most offered trade, meat, cloth, even gold dust. But Thomas refused money. He accepted only what he needed. Soap, ash, bone, pouches, oil. He came at dusk, worked in silence, and left before morning. People began calling him the boy with the wolf line. No one knew exactly what the circle was, only that it worked. But not everyone welcomed his methods. A preacher arrived that spring from back east, trying to bring the word to the settlements. He called Thomas's practices witchcraft. He said the valley had grown soft, too eager to lean on tricks and superstition. He told folks that fear of wolves was a test, that God protected the faithful, not bone circles and burning bowls. And people, tired, grieving, desperate, listened. Some stopped maintaining their circles. Others burned the feathers and threw away the pouches. They let the bones sink into the soil and stopped boiling the ash. And for a time, nothing happened. The wolves didn't come, until they did. The attacks resumed slowly. A dog taken here, a lamb vanished there, a horse found ripped open in in the snow, no tracks around it, the kind of death that makes no sense, the kind Thomas had warned them about. By the time the preacher admitted he might have been wrong, it was too late. 3 families were gone, vanished or dead, and still Thomas said nothing. He just rebuilt what they'd torn down. And then came the worst storm the valley had ever seen, a whiteout that swallowed everything. Temperatures dropped to 20 below, fires froze in hearths, snow piled waist-high in a single night. The wolves moved in silence, cloaked in storm. They came not for food but for territory, for revenge. And Thomas, now 16, stood alone at the edge of the field, circle rebuilt, eyes closed, listening. The next part of this story reveals what happened during that storm. The night Thomas faced down not just wolves, but the full weight of the wilderness itself. The storm didn't come like most storms. It didn't announce itself with dark clouds or wind. It simply appeared, thick, white, choking. 1 hour the fields were bare and frozen under a clear sky, and the next visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. By the time families in the valley realized what was happening, it was too late to flee, too late to fortify. The snow came sideways, driven by wind that howled like an animal in pain. It covered fences in minutes, drifted high against doors, froze windows solid from the inside. The storm swallowed the valley in silence, and inside that silence the wolves moved. They didn't howl, they didn't growl, they didn't need to. The storm was their shroud, the cold their weapon, and the valley, crippled by fear, by forgotten circles, by false hope, was wide open. Most families had scattered. Some had gone south before the worst hit, chasing rumors of milder weather down in the basin. Others stayed behind, thinking their woodpiles and cellars would be enough. They were wrong. Wolves do not fear the cold. They wear it. They thrive in it. The Blakes stayed. Their cabin, rebuilt in the 3rd winter after Elijah's death, sat on a low rise above the frozen creek. The circle Thomas had built that fall was the most complex yet. 37 elements, each selected for its scent, its sound, its shape. Feathers, bones, soapstone etched with symbols, pine pitch jars, pouches of animal glands hung high in the trees to catch the wind. And the arrangement, never the same 2 nights in a row, now followed an internal rhythm Thomas alone understood. It wasn't superstition, it was language, a way to speak to the wolves without words, a way to say, not here, not this place. That night, as the storm hit, Thomas did something he had never done before. He stepped outside the circle. Margaret tried to stop him. She blocked the door with her arms, face pale, lips trembling. "You don't need to prove anything," she said. "You've done enough. They know this place." But Thomas only looked at her, steady, calm, and said, "Not all of them know me, not yet." He took a lantern, wrapped himself in 2 coats and a scarf soaked in pine tar, and vanished into the white. The trees vanished within minutes. So did the path. Even the circle posts, usually easy to spot in the moonlight, were buried under 2 feet of snow. But Thomas moved like someone guided by something deeper than sight. He had memorized every step, every scent marker, every sound the snow made beneath each tree. He walked a spiral path outward, checking the boundaries, resetting disturbed lines, tying fresh bundles, lighting new bowls of pitch that hissed when the snow tried to smother them. And then he heard it. Not a howl, not a growl, a breath, hot, close, behind him. He didn't turn, not immediately. He closed the pouch in his hand, dropped it in the snow, and whispered, "I know you're there." Silence. Then, a low whine, so faint it might have been wind, but Thomas knew better. He turned slowly, lantern raised. A wolf stood 20 feet away. Not just any wolf. This one was massive, thick-coated, eyes gold and clouded with age, body marred with old scars. An alpha, no doubt, the head lowered, tail steady, not submissive, not aggressive, just there. Thomas didn't lift the lantern higher. He didn't reach for a weapon. He did something no one else in the valley would have thought to do. He stepped forward. The wolf didn't move. Thomas knelt in the snow, reached into his coat, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in deer hide. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a skull, small, wolf, cleaned, bleached, and carved with fine lines like veins running from temple to jaw. He set it on the snow between them, then stepped back. "This belonged to one of yours," he said quietly. "It didn't die by my hand." The wind shifted. Snow blew sideways. The wolf lowered its head, sniffed the air, then turned and vanished into the storm. Thomas exhaled, picked up the bundle, rewrapped it, and walked home. What he didn't know, what no one knew until days later, was that the entire west end of the valley had been attacked that night. 3 homesteads gone, 5 people dead, tracks everywhere, blood, shredded canvas, chewed rope, but nothing crossed the invisible line around the Blake cabin. That night marked a turning point, not just for Thomas, for the wolves. Because from that storm forward, the packs changed. They stopped attacking at random. They tested perimeters less. They circled but wider, always at a distance, always watching, and some began to avoid the entire valley altogether. Thomas understood why. He hadn't scared them off. He hadn't confused them. He had communicated. Whatever that moment in the storm was, when he offered the skull, when the old alpha stood before him, it wasn't magic. It was respect, recognition, a predator meeting another predator. Not an enemy, not prey, an equal, but peace, even one brokered by silence, never lasts. The thaw came early that year. Snow melted fast, creeks ran high, and along with spring came strangers, trappers mostly, some settlers. All hungry, all reckless, they shot at shadows, they left carcasses to rot, they dragged wolves from traps still breathing, laughing as they bashed skulls in with rifle butts. And the balance Thomas had worked so hard to build began to crack. The wolves came back, not to test the Blake circle, but to watch him, not from fear, from confusion, from anger. They couldn't understand why the violence had returned. Thomas tried to intervene. He tracked the trappers, stole their baits, cut their lines, destroyed their camps. But there were too many. And then, one night in mid-May, the worst happened. A man named Hale, new to the region, drunk, armed, shot a she-wolf just outside the circle boundary. He didn't know what it was, just saw movement, raised his musket, fired. It dropped. Thomas reached her first. She wasn't dead. The wolf lay bleeding in the snowmelt, panting, eyes wide. Thomas knelt beside her, pressed cloth to the wound, but it was useless. The shot had torn through her ribs. She coughed blood, and around them, unseen in the dusk, the pack gathered. Thomas heard nothing at first. Then slowly, the air shifted. He turned. 7 wolves, silent, staring, the old alpha among them. He met the gaze, then stepped back. He laid his hand on the dying she-wolf's head, whispered something no one heard, and walked away. The wolves didn't follow. They circled the she-wolf. They didn't howl, didn't mourn. They simply lay down beside her as the sun set and the last light bled over the snow. The next morning, she was gone. But in her place, at the very edge of the Blake circle, was a single, perfect paw print, pressed deep into the mud, facing outward. Thomas took that as a message, a question. What now? He didn't have an answer, but he knew the valley couldn't keep going the way it had. The trappers were tearing at the balance. The wolves were reaching their limits. And he, the boy who had once been just a watcher, a barrier maker, now found himself in the middle of something larger, something older than blood or territory. A pact had been made, and someone had broken it, so he made a decision. If the valley was to be safe again, not just from wolves but from men, then he would have to go deeper than scent and circle. He would have to find out what the wolves truly feared. There were stories in the valley, old ones whispered by the Shoshone and the Crow, older still from the French trappers who'd married into the native clans, stories about wolves that didn't behave like wolves, about lines of territory that had nothing to do with rivers or ridges, but with something deeper, older than settlement or season. They spoke of the hollow ground, places where no wolf would tread, even if starvation gripped the land. No hunter ever found a den there, no pup ever played in the snow. No tracks, no kills, just silence. Thomas Blake began asking questions no one wanted to answer. He started with the old Crow man who lived upriver, Hanapi, who never shaved and always smelled of smoke. Hanapi was known to be half-blind and fully mad, but he had lived through 7 winters before Elijah Blake ever touched an axe. Thomas brought him a pouch of crushed tobacco and a piece of boiled salt pork and sat beside his fire until the man started to talk. "You looking for death or memory, boy?" Hanapi rasped, stirring a pot that hadn't had food in it for a day. "The wolves you know ain't the only wolves out here. Some are skin, some are shadow, some wear both and change between." Thomas didn't flinch. He waited. "There's a ridge east of Black Hollow," Hanapi went on, "where the snow never stays right. Not deep, not clean, always wind-swept, always quiet. You see nothing, but the hair on your arms knows. That's hollow ground. They know it. Wolves, elk, even ravens turn when they get near." Thomas nodded slowly. "Why?" The old man shrugged. "Why's the wind scream in the canyon? Why does the moon look bigger in February? Some things just are. But my father told me his grandfather said there were wolves once who got too smart. They stopped being wolves. They started being something else. They lived in places men wouldn't walk, and when they died, the land remembered. It was vague. It was myth. But Thomas had heard something like it before. When he returned to the cabin, he drew a map, crude lines, memory trails, places where attacks never happened. He cross-checked it with stories from the settlers. Attacks near river bends, ambushes in ravines, but never near the Stone Teeth Ridge east of the Black Hollow. It matched Hanapi's ridge. That was where he'd start. Margaret begged him not to go. "You've done enough," she said, tears in her voice for the first time in months. "The wolves know you. You gave them respect. What if this breaks that? What if this is too far?" But Thomas had stopped listening to fear a long time ago. He packed only what he needed: dried meat, lye soap, pitch bowls, bones, one pouch of bitter root, a stone blade he'd carved himself, and the carved skull he'd offered the Alpha months before. No rifle, no steel, just what he considered tools of understanding. He left at dawn before the frost had melted from the fields. The journey east took 2 days on foot. He avoided the old trapper paths. He moved by instinct now, watching the birds, listening for breaks in silence, noting the absence of tracks where tracks should be. And by the 3rd morning he reached the ridge. It didn't look like much. A line of stone outcroppings, wind-worn and pale, jutting from the snow like teeth. No trees, just knee-high grass, frozen in brittle yellow waves, and silence, pure, dead, unbroken. He stepped forward, felt it immediately. The air changed, denser, like breathing through water. His pulse quickened. The wind didn't move the grass here, it moved around it. Thomas walked until the stone ridges surrounded him, then stopped. There were no prints, no droppings, no sign of life, but there were markings, faint scratches on stone, circular patterns, not made by claws, too precise. Something else, a memory etched into the land. He knelt and traced them with his fingers. His skin tingled. This place was old, older than language. He lit a bowl, burned bitter root and pine. The smoke didn't rise, it stayed low, clung to the ground, curled around the stones, and vanished. He placed the skull on a flat rock, ringed it with carved bone chips, and waited. Night fell fast. The moon rose, bloated and low, casting long shadows. The silence deepened, and then, just before midnight, he saw them. Eyes, not glowing, not bright, just visible in the low light, scattered among the ridges. Too many to count, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He placed his hand on the skull and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, but time passed. The next thing he remembered was the wind shifting. Warm, wrong. He opened his eyes. The wolves were gone, but something else was there. A figure. No face, no shape, just an outline. Where the air bent wrong, like heat over a fire, it stood by the skull, then knelt, then vanished. The bones around the skull had changed, arranged into a new pattern, one Thomas didn't recognize. But he knew what it meant, a warning and a gift. He packed the bones carefully, left the skull, and walked out before dawn. The return trip took 3 days. He didn't speak when he got back. Margaret didn't ask. She just hugged him and wept. That summer, Thomas rebuilt the circle again. This time, he incorporated the bone pattern from the ridge. 3 layers, 7 stones, 5 feathers, always arranged clockwise. He placed them on every border: barn, shed, fence, well. He never told anyone what it meant, but the wolves stopped testing entirely. That fall, a new family arrived in the valley, the Cormacs. Desperate, dirt poor, 3 children and a baby. They settled near the far end of the field, close to the ravine. Too close. They didn't believe in wolves, said they were just dogs gone wild, laughed when Thomas tried to help, until the night they vanished. No blood, no bodies, just footprints that ended at the ravine edge, and one broken bowl of pine pitch on the porch. Thomas found the place at dawn, spent hours kneeling beside the broken circle. When he returned home, he said only one thing to Margaret: "They're not all wolves." The valley changed after that. People became more careful. The Blake Circle became legend, but Thomas stopped offering help. He became quiet, distant, focused on refining, not sharing. It was as if something had shifted in him, like he was guarding something sacred or dangerous. Years passed. The wolves never returned, not in numbers, not with hunger. But Thomas never stopped maintaining the circle, every winter, every spring, because whatever he'd seen on the ridge, that presence, that arrangement of bones, it wasn't a peace treaty. It was a deal, and deals with the wilderness always come with cost. Thomas Blake was 23 when the first child disappeared. It was late autumn, the ground already hard with frost, and most families in the valley had finished their harvests. Firewood was stacked chest-high outside nearly every cabin, and meat smoked on hooks in root cellars where the air smelled of fat and salt. The wolves had been quiet for years now, too quiet. Children were growing up never having seen one. Some had begun to think the stories weren't real, just cold country tales told to keep them in line. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen the bones arranged on stone. He'd seen what moved in hollow ground. He kept his circle tighter that year. The usual markers, yes, but now there were others. Thin strands of woven ash bark soaked in vinegar and burnt fat. Stones etched with claw-like notches laid at every threshold. And in the old oak behind the cabin, a new thing: 7 feathers tied together with sinew, hanging from a copper hook. He never explained that one to anyone, not even Margaret. The child who vanished was called Josie Fenn. She was 8, hair like pine needles, sharp and stiff. She'd been walking back from the creek with a tin pail of water, less than 100 yards from her family's door. The prints in the mud said she walked to the bank, knelt, filled the pail, then simply vanished. No blood, no signs of struggle, just water spilled, ripples frozen mid-slosh in the dirt. Thomas was at the Fenn homestead by nightfall. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for clues. He just stood near the edge of the wood line and listened. The wind came low, steady from the north, cold but clean. The trees creaked softly. No birds, no wolves, no animal sounds at all, only silence. He knelt, scooped a handful of dirt from near the pail, smelled it. He stood, walked back to the house, told the Fenns to keep every lantern lit that night, and not to speak any names aloud after dark. Not Josie's, not their own, not even God's. "They're listening again," he said. The father laughed, a short, broken thing, the kind of laugh a man makes when his guts know something his mind won't admit. Thomas didn't argue. He left before the moon rose. He returned home and began rebuilding the circle from scratch, tore down every post, burned every cloth strip, buried the bones deep beneath the frost line. And then he began carving. He worked through the night, hands blistered, raw, shaping ash wood into new totems, 3 feet high, hollowed at the center, carved with a pattern that didn't belong to the valley, something he'd seen in a dream he never spoke of. The next day, he planted them in the 4 cardinal directions from the cabin: east, west, north, south. Then he waited. More children vanished in the days that followed. Not all at once, not all from the same places, but always the same pattern. The signs were subtle. No blood, no tracks, no struggle, only missing warmth, a kettle gone cold, a shoe left behind, a wooden horse dropped in the snow, and always that same soundlessness. The settlers were terrified, but they didn't call them wolf attacks anymore. These were something else. They whispered of spirits, of curses. Some said it was the price for driving the wolves away all those years ago. Others said it was Thomas's fault, that he'd tampered with things not meant to be touched. A group of 5 men rode to the Blake cabin one evening, armed, scared, angry. They found Thomas on the roof, mending the eaves with pine resin. "Enough!" one shouted. "We know you've been doing strange things. You stirred them up. You brought this." Thomas didn't look down. He spoke without turning. "I warned you when you tore down your circles." A second man raised his rifle. "What did you bring into this valley?" Now Thomas turned. His eyes were rimmed with black, not from sleep or sickness, but from the pitch he'd rubbed beneath them to keep his vision sharp against the wind. He looked older, leaner. His voice didn't shake. "I didn't bring them. I kept them out." The men hesitated. Something in his face made their fingers twitch against triggers, but they didn't fire. Margaret came to the door, holding a pot of boiling pine water. Silent, the men left. That night the wind howled in a new pitch. It wasn't natural. It had voice, rhythm, like something crying across a great distance. And the next morning, Josie Fenn was standing at the edge of the field, alive, but changed. Her eyes were clouded, not blind, just distant. Her lips were blue, though her skin was warm. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared at the cabin until Thomas stepped outside. He didn't go to her. He knelt, set a bowl of burning pitch in the snow, and placed one of the carved ash totems beside it. Josie blinked, looked down, then screamed. It wasn't a child's scream. It was guttural, deep, echoing, the kind of sound that turns bones hollow. Margaret stepped out, hand to her mouth. Thomas didn't move. He just whispered something beneath his breath, too soft to catch. Josie collapsed. She slept for 3 days. When she woke, her eyes were clear. Her voice was low and uncertain, but she remembered. Not everything, just fragments. She said there were shadows with teeth, eyes behind bark, sounds that lived in the soil, and always the cold. But she remembered something else, a voice that told her not to speak, that if she made a sound, it would become her, and she would never come back. She said the only reason she made it back was because the shape in the bones whispered louder. That shape, Thomas realized, was the new circle, the ash totems. He'd built a language that spoke even in their silence. He knew then what was happening. The wolves were gone, but something had taken their place, something that had once worn the wolves. The pact had been broken not just by bullets or bones, but by neglect. The settlers had stopped speaking the old language, stopped making the offerings. They had left the gate open, and something had walked through. Not wolves, not spirits, remnants. He went back to the ridge, alone, against Margaret's pleading. He carried no tools, only the skull from before and the new pattern of bones, recarved, reburied in salt. He waited. The same presence came, the same bending of air, but this time it spoke, not in words, in feeling, in intention. Thomas understood. The hollow ground had rules, and the valley had broken them. There would be no more warnings. The settlers had until the next frost. After that, it would not be wolves that came down from the hills. Thomas left the ridge, came home, and for the first time in his life, He called the valley together. Every family, every child, every widow and hunter and merchant. He stood before them in the snow and told the truth. Told them what had been held back, what he'd bargained for, what he'd broken, and what was coming. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He gave instructions. Rebuild your circles. Burn the pitch. Speak no names aloud at night. And if you hear a child crying beyond the tree line, do not answer. That winter would test everything Thomas had learned, because the storm that came that year wasn't made of snow or wind. It was made of silence. And within it, the wolves walked upright. The silence came first. Days before the storm, before the first track in the snow, before the wind started to curl at the edges of the hills, there was silence. Birds stopped calling. The dogs would not bark. The well behind the fen homestead, once filled with the constant groan of frogs and insects even through winter's edge, now sounded like it had been plugged with wool. At night, the air was still. No frost cracked. No branches groaned. Even the wind, long a constant friend and enemy to anyone who'd survived a winter in the valley, fell mute. The valley held its breath, and in that breathless quiet, something stepped across the boundary. It was the night after the last circle had been rebuilt. Every homestead had obeyed Thomas's instructions, whether from fear or trust or just plain desperation. Even the preacher who had once called Thomas a heretic now wore ash marks on his cheeks and placed burning bowls beside his chapel doors. Bone patterns marked the windows. Pouches of pitch hung from every eave. The smell of vinegar, fat, resin, and burnt sage choked the air. But even that wasn't enough. The storm hit without snow, no warning, no cold, just a presence, a pressure on the chest like standing underwater. Lamps flickered and died. Chimneys that had been smoking all day suddenly backed up, flooding homes with soot. And from the woods came the sounds, not howls, not growls, words, or something that almost sounded like them. Half-spoken syllables formed from breath and cold and hunger. Language without language. At the Blake cabin, Thomas stood barefoot on the porch, ash totems planted in a ring around him, a single flame burning in the copper bowl at his feet. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He watched the tree line where shapes shifted. Tall, wrong, elongated. Not wolves, not men, something between. One stepped forward. It walked like a man, but with joints that bent the wrong way. Its arms were too long, its head too narrow, and its eyes, when they caught the firelight, didn't glow. They reflected, like glass. Behind it came others. They made no sound on the snow. No steam curled from their mouths. They moved like memory, like shadow made solid. Margaret was inside, pressing her hands together, whispering old prayers she barely remembered. She'd stopped trying to convince Thomas to come back inside. She knew better now. Some boundaries could not be protected by walls. The figures didn't cross the circle. They paced it, tapped the air between each totem with clawed hands, tested the lines, and then the largest among them, taller than a man, skin like parchment stretched over a framework of old bone, stepped forward and stopped, not 10 paces from Thomas. It lifted one hand and opened its fingers. In its palm was a child's boot. It tossed it across the circle. Thomas didn't flinch. He reached down, lifted the bowl of flame, and walked forward 3 steps, until the edge of the circle's boundary hummed in his ears. The air shimmered. The figures shifted backward, all except the tall one. "I know what you are," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are what's left when men forget." The tall one tilted its head. "You fed on our neglect, on broken pacts, on fire left cold, but you don't belong here. This valley was theirs first, and they kept it clean." The figures behind the tall one hissed, not a sound of breath or rage, but like pages tearing, like language unwriting itself. Thomas lifted the bowl higher. The flame twisted green-blue in the windless air. "You want a gate? Build one somewhere else." The tall figure stepped back, not in fear, in respect, and then it vanished, not in a burst, not in a blink, just faded, like it had never been there at all. The others followed. Thomas lowered the bowl. The next morning, the valley awoke to find the silence broken. Birds returned. The wind picked up. Frost cracked on the pond ice. Fires burned clean. The dogs barked. And Josie Fenn smiled again. But the boot remained, blackened at the sole, soaked in something that wasn't water. It sat beside the porch for days before Thomas buried it under the tree where he'd laid his father. After that winter, everything changed. The wolves returned, but they came differently now. They didn't stalk the homesteads. They didn't howl. They didn't test the circle. They moved through the woods in broad daylight, calm, watchful. Once, Thomas saw one standing beside the edge of the field, just watching the house. When he stepped outside, it didn't run. It bowed its head, then turned and walked back into the trees. The settlers noticed too. They began rebuilding with stone and ash. They left offerings by their fences, not blood or meat, but memory, locks of hair, carvings of wood. They told stories at night about the winters that had come before. They remembered, and the valley grew quiet again, not the silence of fear, but of peace. But peace, Thomas knew, is never permanent. One summer morning, a group of men came from the north, government men, surveyors, cartographers, men with clean boots and steel spectacles and hard questions. They'd heard about the valley, about the land, about the strange marks on the maps that labeled this stretch of wilderness unsettled despite over 20 years of habitation. They asked Thomas where his property lines lay. He looked at them with that same flat gaze he'd once given Royce Weller. "We don't draw lines here," he said. "We keep them." They laughed. 2 weeks later, they returned with workers and stakes and tools. They began clearing land for a road, a proper road, through the ridge, through the hollow ground. Thomas tried to stop them. He stood in front of their equipment, pleaded, explained. They ignored him. "Superstition," one of them said. "We'll have this place mapped and cleared by winter." And that was when Thomas did something he swore he never would. He went back to the ridge. He brought nothing. No fire, no bowl, no skull. He walked into the stones alone, and he knelt. Whatever lived there remembered him, respected him. But what he asked that day was not small. He asked for intervention. And the cost would come due. That winter the workers vanished. Every one of them. No blood, no tracks. Only a series of stakes arranged in perfect spirals, laid out across the new clearing, like ribs from some ancient carcass. The government men left, quietly, without questions, and the valley was never surveyed again. Years passed. Thomas grew older. His hair turned grey, his hands stiffened. But every year before the first frost, he walked the perimeter and rebuilt the circle. His steps slowed, but the work never did. He taught the children, quietly, respectfully, not just the how, the why. He told them stories that weren't written down, gave them symbols to carve, recipes to mix, words to never say. He told them about balance, and then, one winter, he didn't wake up. Margaret found him seated on the porch, the bowl still burning at his feet, eyes closed, a feather in one hand, a stone in the other. No wolves came that winter, none the next. But beside the tree where Elijah was buried, where the child's boot had been laid, where the totems had once stood, a circle of stones had appeared, 7 of them, each carved, each marked, and in the center fresh snow never fell, because memory once kept becomes a kind of shield, and Thomas Blake had taught the valley how to remember. By the time the first child of the next generation came of age, the old ways had become habit, not superstition, not ritual, practice. The circle was no longer something spoken of in whispers or consulted in secret. It was part of life, as essential as chopping firewood, salting meat, or patching roofs before the thaw. Every child knew which direction the feathers had to face, how to burn pitch without suffocating the flame, how to carve the bone pattern, even if their hands shook with cold. It was just how things were done. But with time, things softened, as they always do. Thomas Blake had been dead for 6 winters when the first new family settled at the edge of the north slope. They came in late, just as the last meltwater was soaking into the thawing ground. The father, Edgar Morrow, was a widower with twin daughters and the worn-out look of a man who'd run from too many debts in too many towns. He claimed he didn't believe in mountain tales, said he'd raised his girls just fine in the Dakotas, without bone signs and dog voodoo. When the neighbors offered to help him mark his new homestead with the circle, he declined politely. "They're just wolves," he said. "We'll keep the fire burning and the doors shut." But fire doesn't keep out silence, and doors don't stop something that doesn't knock. The first sign came during the first frost of October. The twins, Eliza and May, were playing near the woodpile when they stopped moving, just stopped, staring into the tree line. The mother of the neighboring farm saw them from across the fence, said they didn't blink, didn't breathe, just watched something she couldn't see. When she called out, the girls turned and walked inside, slowly, unblinking. They didn't speak for 2 days. Edgar laughed it off. "Girls gotta chill, that's all." The second sign was subtler. The wind stopped blowing across the ridge for a full week. Not a breeze, not a stir. The tall grass behind the Morrow cabin lay flat and untouched, like it had been painted there. At night, the dogs didn't bark. They whimpered. Then one vanished. Then the chickens stopped laying. Then the mirror in the Morrow cabin cracked. No one had touched it. No one had even been in the room. The neighbors warned Edgar again, begged him. "At least burn pitch at night," one said. "At least hang the ash feathers." But he didn't. He wouldn't. "I came here to raise my girls, not bow to fairy tales." The night before the first snow, the oldest twin, Eliza, began to speak again. Just 3 words, repeated over and over. "They're in the walls." She said it while standing in the middle of the cabin floor, eyes wide, not looking at anyone, just staring at the empty hearth. There in the walls, May hadn't spoken at all, just stared out the window. That night, the wind returned, and with it, the old sounds, rustling, scraping, like claws behind the boards. And not in the corners, everywhere, inside the rafters, beneath the floor, behind the fireplace. Edgar sat up all night, rifle on his knees. He didn't see anything, but in the morning, Eliza was gone. No door opened, no window cracked, just the imprint of her feet in the ash by the hearth, leading into the fireplace, and stopping. May was sitting on the floor, holding one of the feathers the neighbors had offered and Edgar had thrown into the trash. She was humming, a tune no one recognized. The next day, the entire valley came to help. No judgment, no sermons. Just action. They rebuilt the Morrow Circle from scratch. Not for Edgar, but for May. They didn't ask permission. They just worked. Bones were carved, stones placed, ash circles painted, feathers hung, smoke lit and allowed to curl into the trees. Edgar watched in silence. When it was done, he dropped his rifle and asked the neighbors what to do next. "Listen," they said, and for the first time since Thomas Blake had been laid beneath the soil, someone new listened. Over the next few weeks, the wind carried sound again. Birds returned. The ice frost broke earlier than expected, and one morning, just before sunrise, Eliza came back. She was standing at the edge of the field, the circle between her and the cabin. She didn't step inside. She didn't speak, but she held out her hand. In it was a small wooden carving, a wolf, perfectly formed, something no child could have carved in a week, let alone during a night spent in whatever lay beyond the circle. May ran to her. The circle didn't stop her. Eliza blinked once, then stepped forward. The family never spoke of what happened, not publicly, but Edgar became one of the fiercest keepers of the old ways. Every year, he walked the field alone, carving new totems, burying old bones, painting the ash again and again, until it turned his fingers grey. He taught the other children, told them the stories with no embellishment, just the facts. How wolves had once come every winter, how something else had followed, and how a boy named Thomas had taught the valley that fear wasn't weakness, that listening was a kind of strength. The circle grew over time, not in size but in meaning. Markers were passed from generation to generation. Each family had their own twist, different pouches, different feathers, slightly altered patterns, but the core remained, unchanged, respected. And then, one summer, the travelers came. Tourists, campers, outsiders. They brought cameras and tents, radios and beer. They laughed at the bones, took pictures of the totems, burned garbage in fire pits made from the carved stones. One even stole a feather, called it primitive art, and nailed it to his trailer door. The valley bristled. The circle held for a while. But that year, the snow came early, and with it, a storm unlike any the valley had ever seen. Not snow, not ice, memory. Memories began to vanish. People forgot where they'd put their tools. Then they forgot names, then faces, then who had lived in which cabin. The trees began to lean the wrong way. Chimneys spun smoke downward. Salt turned bitter. Water wouldn't boil. Milk wouldn't spoil. Shadows moved the opposite direction of the sun. And then, one morning, the pictures of Thomas Blake, kept in the chapel, carved into wood, painted in ash, began to fade, not crack, not peel, fade, until there was nothing. The preacher's son, now old himself, called a gathering. He stood in the chapel, trembling, holding a burnt bowl of pine pitch that no longer smoked. "We forgot," he said, voice cracking. "Not all at once, but piece by piece, we let them in." A girl stood, the daughter of May, granddaughter of Edgar. She was 10. She walked to the front, took the bowl, and whispered a word. Not English, not anything known, but something old, a shape of sound passed down like bone. The bowl caught flame, blue and green. Outside, the trees straightened, the wind returned, the names came back, and in the chapel corner, a painting of Thomas Blake reappeared. Just faintly, but enough. That girl would grow up to teach the valley what Thomas had once taught, that winter always returns, that wolves are not the enemy, that forgetting is, and that the circle must be rebuilt, not just in wood and ash, but in story, in memory. The final part of this story reveals the last secret Thomas Blake carried to his grave, and how it was finally uncovered by those who refused to forget. They found the journal sealed in beeswax, buried beneath the hearthstone of the Blake cabin 37 years after Thomas died. The cabin itself had long since been converted into a gathering hall, not a church, not a government post, just a place where families met when decisions needed to be made. Its walls were still made from the same hand-hewn logs that Elijah Blake had once dragged from the ridge. Its roof had been patched 100 times, its doors rehung, but the hearth remained untouched, revered, quiet. No one had ever thought to look beneath it. It was a boy named Davy, 11 years old, son of the woman who now kept the northmost boundary, that pried the stone loose. He was chasing a cricket through the cracks in the floorboards when he noticed a strange mark carved into the edge of the stone. Not a letter, not even a symbol, just a line, straight, deep, deliberate, something meant to outlast weather and eyes and time. The adults didn't believe him at first, but the mark stirred something in the memory of the old preacher's son. He'd seen it once before, on the back of a stone set at the foot of the hollow ridge, a mark Thomas Blake had carved the morning after the last storm, the morning before he died. They lifted the stone together. It took 6 men and a pry bar. Beneath it, they found a bundle wrapped in waxed canvas. Inside that, layers of oiled cloth, and inside that, bound in leather and sealed with pine resin, was the journal. Its pages were stiff but intact, ink faded but legible. The first entry was dated the winter after the hollow ridge. The handwriting was angular, controlled, written by a man who had learned to think faster than he spoke. If someone is reading this, then it means either the storms have returned or memory has failed. I can't say which would be worse, but I write this not for fear, not to warn, but to teach. The circle is not about wolves. It never was. It is about pattern, about presence, about a shape that the world remembers. Even when people forget, I didn't invent it, I only remembered it. The journal was not a story. It was not even chronological. It was a map of ideas, recipes, carvings, observations, pages filled with sketches of feather arrangements, angles of stone placements, notes on the behavior of wind when smoke is burned at different times of day, thoughts on silence, on memory, on grief. I have come to believe that the thing in the ridge, the tall one, is not an enemy. It is not a friend either. It is the memory of danger, a pressure that keeps the world from becoming soft. We forgot it once, and it came back to remind us. It doesn't need to feed. It doesn't need to win. It only needs to be noticed. There were pages written in code, short phrases where the letters didn't make sense until someone realized they were mirror-written, words that could only be read when held to the light of flame, not oil or sun. Do not burn meat after moonrise. Do not speak a child's name twice in one breath. Do not cut pine on the 3rd night of frost. These are not rules, they are agreements. Toward the end, the tone changed, became more reflective, tired. I once thought I was protecting us from something outside, but I see now that I was protecting us from ourselves. We break things. That's what we do, even sacred ones, especially sacred ones. And so, I built a language we couldn't unlearn, a shape we'd repeat without knowing why. I hid the need inside the habit. That way, even when the reason fades, the action remains. The last page had no writing, just a single shape, a circle of 7 stones, a feather above it, and beneath it, the oldest mark known to the valley, a child's boot print facing outward. The discovery of the journal changed the valley, but not in the way outsiders might think. There was no sudden conversion, no panic, no hysteria. Instead, there was understanding, like finding a message you'd already memorized by heart without knowing who wrote it. Children were now taught to read not just books, but bone. They practiced carving ash before they learned their letters. Firekeeping was taught before arithmetic. Memory became part of education. And once a year, on the night of the first frost, the valley gathered in silence. They didn't speak, they didn't sing. They walked from one to another, placing small carved stones at the edge of each family's circle. It wasn't a ritual, not a performance. It was a conversation between the living and the old memory that lived in the trees. Outsiders came and went. Some tried to settle. Most left within a year. The valley had a feeling that didn't sit well with those who couldn't feel it. Roads were never paved. Electricity never stuck. There were talks, always talks about modernization. But the land pushed back. Trees regrew where they shouldn't. Fences collapsed in strange ways. Machinery refused to work past the tree line. The hollow ridge remained untouched. And the wolves, those who still remained, came closer every year. But not to stalk, to watch, to remember. Sometimes on cold mornings you'd see one standing at the edge of a field where the circle line was drawn. And if you looked close, you'd see something tied around its neck. Not rope, not a collar, a feather, knotted with ash string. And if you blinked, it would be gone. Margaret Blake lived another 10 years after Thomas died. She never remarried, never moved, never changed a thing in that cabin. When she passed, they found her seated by the hearth, the same way. They'd found her son, eyes closed, hands at rest, a faint trace of pitch in the bowl beside her. On the mantel above her head, someone had placed the wooden carving of a wolf, the one Eliza had brought back from beyond the circle all those years ago. No one admitted to putting it there. No one ever claimed it, and no one touched it. It's still there, to this day, cracked now, faded, but unmistakable. So how did the widow's son keep the wolves away? With traps, with fire, With threats? No, he didn't keep them away. He taught them where not to go. He didn't kill them, he understood them, and then he taught his people how to be understood in return. He built a shape that even hunger feared to cross, a pattern older than speech, a memory carved into bone and air and ash, not to conquer the wild, but to live with it, to honor it, to remember that what watches from the woods is never just watching, it is waiting, waiting to see if you've forgotten, waiting to see if you still speak the language of respect, because the worst thing that can happen to a place is not that it is hunted, it is that it is forgotten. And the circle, Thomas Blake's circle, is not just protection, it is memory, alive, and remembering you.